In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to create a posable sandbag wall in a way that's accessible to users that haven't necessarily used Blender before. So I'm going to cover a lot of the basics and try and go into detail about what actions I'm actually taking to get the different effects that I'm going for. The first thing we're going to want to do to create our sandbag is get the approximate shape down. So right now we start with a default cube, which isn't the right shape that we're going for. We want more of a squat bar look. So if we look on the left-hand side, we see all of these tools. And these are tools that are pretty mouse-friendly if you don't want to use the keyboard. And they're all of the basic functions you would want for changing an object. For instance, we have move, so we can move the cube around, rotate, so we can change its direction, and scale, so we can change its size. So what we want is to scale it right now. So in order to scale it on just one axis, I'm going to pick an axis, so that's indicated by these lines with the cubes on the end. I'm going to start with the z-axis, so I'm just going to make it squatter. We'll go about here. And then I'm going to resize it on the x-axis. And let's say that looks okay. I'm not going for anything super accurate. Just approximate's fine. Now that we have the basic shape, super basic shape of our sandbag, we're going to try and get it more into the final form that we want. So obviously this has pretty sharp edges, which don't look like a sandbag at all. We want something that's a bit more round, a bit more pillowy looking. So Blender has a modifier, and you can find modifiers over on this right-hand side. This is called the Properties area. And it's this little wrench icon that has Modifier Properties. So I'm just going to click on that with my cube selected. And then you have this drop down called Add Modifier. So I'm going to click on that, and I'm going to go down to Subdivision Service. So this is a modifier that is designed to add more geometry to your object. And you can see as soon as I add it, it's already changed the object pretty drastically. It went from being a rectangle with some sharp edges to this funny little domed object. Not at all what we want really, but it's closer. So if I were to increase over here the viewport levels, which is what we're looking at, from 1 to 2, you can see more faces have been added. So I'll toggle that again from, this is 1 to 2. More faces are being added. And so the higher we go up for the levels, the more faces get added each time. Now you can see that the faces are pretty small now. We actually don't need that much detail, so we're going to keep it at 2 for now. But these are all non-destructive, which means that modifiers keep the original object, so we can still work off of it. And this is great for us because we still want something halfway in between what the subdivision surface is giving us and that original bar that we have. So in order to find a happy in between, I'm going to change my mode. Right now we're in object mode, which means that we can move, rotate, scale, add and delete entire objects. But what I want to do right now is edit individual properties of this specific object. And so I'm going to go to this drop down up in the upper left hand corner where it says object mode, Click on that. Now I'm going to now select Edit Mode. So in orange here, because it's selected, you can see our original bar. But we can also see the mesh that the subdivision surface is giving us. So from this reference, this wireframe reference, the subdivision surface is calculating this internal object. And you can see that if from these points of the rectangle, if I start moving them, the internal object reacts to that. Now, what I want to do is tell the subdivision surface to not round the edges quite so harshly. And Blender calls that Crease Data. So in the upper left-hand corner, right beside where I change modes, I'm going to keep it in Edit Mode, but right to the right of that, you can see currently highlighted is Vertex Select. And that means that I can select individual points of this object. To the right of that is Edge Select, which lets me select entire edges of the object. And then to the right of that is Face Select, which lets me select entire faces. So right now I want to be in Edge Select mode. So I am going to, with my left mouse button and holding Shift, I'm going to select these 4 corners, and I'm going to modify their crease data. Now I can find that data by going up here where this tiny little arrow is and clicking. It's going to reveal this whole panel. So I want to be on the Item tab over here. So now I'm in the Item tab. And what I'm looking for is this mean crease value. So this is going to tell the subdivision modifier how sharp I want these corners to be. Right now it's at 0, so it's smoothing them out as much as it wants. And you can see if I go all the way up to 1, all of a sudden these are really sharp. So I don't think I want them quite that sharp, because it's still supposed to be a bag and the edges shouldn't cut you. So we'll go for about there. I'm just sort of eyeballing what I want. And that looks pretty good. Now I think I want to modify these edges as well, just to make it a little bit less sort of smooth there. I'm not going to put it as high. You can see if I go it all the way to 1, now it becomes sort of like a tube. So I don't want it that harsh. Just want a bit to make it look like it's a bulging canvas bag or burlap. And I think that looks okay as a start for our sandbag. So now that we have that crease data, we can see that if we decrease the subdivision levels, it's still going to have that same basic shape that we want, just less faces. And same way if we increase it, it's still going to have a really nice shape. So now that we have the basic shape we want, we're going to try to add more detail by doing some very simple sculpting. So sculpting wants a lot of vertex data. So we're actually going to go over to the subdivision modifier. We're going to increase it to, say, we'll do 5. And in order to make sure that this works properly for sculpting, we're going to apply this modifier. And once we apply a modifier, it means that we can no longer change these values. So we won't be able to decrease the levels anymore or tweak it by changing the crease data. but that's fine because we're happy with where we're at. So with this object selected, I'm going to change my mode again. In the upper left-hand corner, going from Object Mode to Sculpt Mode. And so once I change to Sculpt Mode, the viewport doesn't change too much, but we get a lot of different tools on this left-hand side. And the menu up here changes as well. So I think the main feature I want for this back is a little line that goes around, which seems to be a common feature of sandbags. So in order to do that, I'm going to change to this Draw Sharp tool. So that's going to help us get the really well-defined line that we want. Before I start drawing, I'm going to turn on some symmetry. So I'm going to turn on symmetry on the X and the Y axes. And you can see if I put my cursor over the object now, in addition to where my cursor is, there are 3 other points. And that's because the cursor is now being replicated over 2 different axes. And so when I draw, you can see it's been done 4 times. So I'm going to do Control-Z to undo that really quickly. I'm going to make sure that my Draw Sharp tool is in the plus direction, which means it's going to add geometry. When I drew just now, it was in the negative direction, so it was creating dents in the object, which isn't what I want. I think the size of my brush is okay, but if I wanted to change it, I can change it right here. So, for instance, I can make a really big radius, which would draw a really big line, almost as big as the object. Or I could create one that's really small. But we'll turn it up a little bit, down a little bit, we'll do it around 50. Around 50. Then I'm going to turn up my strength because I want this to be a pretty strong line. We'll see if this is where I want it. So I'm just going to start in the middle over here, and I'm going to click and hold. I'm just going to drag my mouse all around. So because I have symmetry enabled, if I look all around the object, oops, ignore that. If I look all around the object, you should see this line replicated very cleanly around it. Now that we're done sculpting our simple sandbag, I want to make an entire sandbag wall. So the first thing I'm going to do is go out of Sculpt Mode and into Object Mode. From there, I'm going to add Mesh Grid. So this grid is going to become our wall. And right now this object is in the way, so I'm going to hide it by going up here to where this little eye is next to my cube object, which is our sandbag. Just clicking on the eye so that it disappears from our view. So now I'm going to click on this wall, and I'm going to rotate it by going over here to the Transform pane with the Item tab selected, and I'm going to rotate it over the y-axis exactly 90 degrees. So in order to make this wall, I'm going to use something called geometry nodes, and that is a type of modifier. So over here, I'm going to select the wrench, I'm going to go to Add Modifier and Geometry Nodes. Now that doesn't do anything right away. We actually have to go to the Geometry Node Editor. So in order to do that, I'm going to look at this little line down here, put my mouse over it until I have these double arrows, and then click and drag to bring this up. Now this is the timeline, but we're not actually using the timeline. Over in the left-hand corner of this area, we're going to click on this to change to the Geometry Node Editor. Now I'm going to use the middle mouse button. I'm going to press that and then zoom in with it. You'll see we have two nodes here, and this is controlling what geometry gets outputted. Now the geometry output, if we were to disconnect it, you'd see that our object suddenly disappears. That's because there's nothing in the output. So if we put back the geometry input, or the group input, into the output, then our object will reappear. Now the geometry node editor lets us do something pretty cool. And if we go into edit mode, and then we go to a vertex select, we can see all of these vertexes. And what our goal right now is to replace these vertexes with sandbags. So in order to do that with the geometry node editor, we can go to add, and I'll do point instance. So this node determines that for every point, it will put an instance of another object instead. So I'm going to drag this over the line, connecting the input to the output, and then just drop it. And then for object, I'm going to select our cube. And the cube is the sandbag that we just hid. Now right now you can tell this is all wonky. It's not the right dimensions, it's not the right shape. And part of the problem that we're having is that we did some transforms earlier with the scale of the sandbag, and Blender doesn't really like that. So I'm going back to object mode, and I'm hiding the grid, and I'm showing the sandbag, and I'm going to click on the sandbag. So if you look over on this transform pane, which I got to by selecting the item tab, you can see that scale is about 0.6, 1, 0.3, or 0.293. And when we look back at the grid, Blender is applying a scale of 111 to all of the objects that it's outputting. So in order to tell Blender these are the actual dimensions that we want, we're going to do Control A, and then in this Apply menu, we're going to click All Transforms. So that's changed our scale to 111 now, which means Blender is now respecting it. So I'm going to hide the sandbag again, show the grid, and now you can see that the sandbags are a bit less giant, a bit less thick. Another problem is that we rotated this plane over the y-axis. So it's considering the z-axis our x-axis right now. So to fix that, we're just going to do the same thing and do Control A with this grid selected and hit All Transforms. And that's going to put these sandbags the right side up. Alright, so now that we've done that, sandbags are still a bit too big, and they are our original size. So in order to fix this, I'm just going to go to Add in the Geometry Node Editor, and then I'm going to Point and Point Scale. So this will let me change the scale of all of these objects. Vector lets me change the scale on each dimension separately, but I actually want to do this uniformly on all dimensions. So I'm going to go to Float instead of Vector. I'm going to reduce the size like this. Just going to click, click, click. Alright, so this is okay. Obviously things are overlapping in ways that we don't necessarily want. And how I'm going to fix that is first by changing the internals of the object. So I'm going to go to Edit Mode. I'm going to press A to select everything. And I'm going to scale this down on the Z axis. So you can see that the objects, the sandbags, are staying the same size, but I'm closing and expanding the gap between them by just scaling these points on the Z axis. So say I want them like that. So that looks okay, where everything is meshed together. We could also scale them on, for instance, the y-axis to bring them apart. So let's see, how dense do we want this to be? We'll say about here, so that there's some overlap between sandbags, but not a ton. So that looks like an okay sandbag wall, but everything is stacked one on top of the other. We've got these little gaps too, so we obviously need to keep doing some tweaking. So while in edit mode, it's a bit hard to see the points right now, so I'm going to go to this geometry nodes modifier, and I'm going to click this button with the square with points, and that's going to show me my original object. So this is the original grid without the sandbags in it. And what I want to do is offset each alternate row. So I'm going to select a row by holding down the Alt key and clicking on the edge that I want to select the contiguous lines for. So this is called a loop select, and now I'm going to hold down Alt and Shift and use the left mouse button. And I'm just going to go ahead and select every other line. So now that I have that done, I want to move these along the y-axis. And I'm going to just sort of eyeball this. So I'm going to do G, which is the shortcut for moving. I'm going to press Y because I want to move them along the y-axis. You can see now I can move everything I have selected along the y-axis. So I'm going to go ahead and do it about halfway. And I'm going to turn back on the geometry nodes so I can actually see what this looks like. So it's not bad. It looks like I might need to shift it a bit more. Alright, I think that looks pretty good. Now we've still got gaps in between the sandbags. So I think that just means that I need to decrease that gap overall. So I'm going to press A to select all of the points. If we turn these sandbags off, you can see I have all of the points selected. And then I'm going to size them with S and only on the Z axis, so I can make them as dense or as loose as I want. We'll go to about here. Now it looks like they're all stacked up. Now this looks pretty good. I'm going to go back out of edit mode to object mode. Part of the problem with the way this looks though is that everything is very uniform. Everything is lined up perfectly. So I'm going to add a bit of randomness to this. I'm going to do that through a few more nodes. So if we go to add point, excuse me, attribute randomize is the node we want, which is what I just searched for. So add attribute randomize is how to get it to it through the menu. So from attribute randomize, I'm going to type in the attribute I want to change, and we'll start with rotation. This needs to be on vector because rotation is going to happen in 3 dimensions. So right now it's randomly rotating all of these sandbags for each different vertex from 0 to 1. And that's a lot. We don't really want that. So we're going to set, right now all the minimums are 0, so we're going to set the maxes to 0 as well, so that there is no rotation of anything. So if we were to rotate this on the z-axis, you can tell that as I increase this maximum value and decrease it, the rotations change accordingly. So I don't want the variation to be huge. We'll say from 0.3, and then we'll put the minimum as negative 0.3 and see how that looks. That's not bad, maybe a little bit extreme, but I think it looks good enough. And now if we try changing this axis, the x-axis, this is a little bit more dramatic even than the z-axis, so we'll just do maybe negative 0.1, let's do 0.1 for max, negative 0.1 for minimum. And then on the y-axis, I think we can get away with negative 0.3 for the minimum, 0.3 for the maximum. This looks pretty hectic, so I'm going to turn it down and reduce the variation. Alright, so now we've got a pretty varied looking wall. I'm going to add just a little bit more variation though by adding another attribute, randomization. This time we're going to go based on scale. So with a min of 0 and a max of 1, obviously these get way too big. So I'm going to set this is if it's 0.2, and we're going to set this to say, let's say 0.15 for the minimum. We want to make sure that we still don't have giant gaps. We'll say 0.3, it's still too much. I'll say 0.18 for the minimum, 0.22 for the maximum. So now we've got different size sandbags in there. So we've got a cool looking sandbag wall, and one of the benefits of having this geometry node set up is that we can modify the ball very easily. So right now, if we go into wireframe mode, and I do that by pressing Z and then going over to the left and just letting go of Z, we can see the nodes that are controlling the placements of the sandbags. So if I were to, for instance, move this sandbag up and move its node up, or go back to solid mode, you can see it's now just floating. I can move it down wherever I want. And that also means that, let's go back to wireframe mode, if I were to select these four and delete them, and I pressed X, and I'm going to delete vertices. Now I'll go back to solid mode. I can create a hole really easily. So let's say I don't want a hole that's necessarily that big. So in edit mode, I'm just going to take 1, and I'm going to delete just 2 around it, just to give the wall a little bit of character. Another cool thing we can do is change the shape of this wall from something that's just straight to curved. And we can do that using modifiers. So I'm going to first add our curve, and that's with Shift-A to get the add menu. Then I'm going to go to curve, and I'm going to add a NURBS curve. So the NURBS curve, I'm going to select it, and I'm going to go into edit mode. And the NURBS curve works off of these points. And I want to make the curve a bit longer. So I'm going to select the two endpoints. I'm going to press E to extrude, and then I'm going to press Y so that I can extrude along the Y axis. And it's going to give me this dome shape. Now, I want the wall, our straight wall, to follow this shape. And I'm going to do that by selecting the wall, going to Add Modifier, and selecting the Curve modifier. And under the Curve modifier, I'm going to pick the curve object, which is our NURBS curve. So already our wall has taken a different kind of shape. It's not quite the one we wanted. Part of the problem is that this object, this curve, is on a different axis than what we want the deform to be on. So I'm going to go ahead and rotate this curve 90 degrees on the Z axis. And you can see that our wall has now snapped to the curve pretty much how we wanted it. It's a little bit short on the Y side, so I'm going to move the wall over on the Y axis. You can see that as I go back and forth, the wall is following the curve precisely. So I'm going to say put it right there. So now we've got a cool little curved section of our sandbag wall with some holes inside of it. Now another problem I see with this wall is that it has these sort of end bags hanging off that we don't necessarily want. I'm going to fix that in probably the laziest way possible. I'm just going to go from object mode to edit mode with the sandbag wall selected. I'm going to change to wireframe mode so I can see individual points. And I'm going to select the points that are on the end. And then I'm going to press S for size and Y so that I can size them on the Y axis. And that'll bring them in and out as I move my mouse. So I'm just going to pick something where they're not extruding too much. Not quite all the way in, so there's not too much overlap. Now if I go back to solid, you can see that the ends aren't quite as jutting out as they were before. And I can of course change that to my liking. So now there's some overlap between the bags, or more overlap than there was before. I'm not too worried about that. We're not going for super precise.